Israel-based independent consultancy, Effective Partnerships in Today's Jewish World. After 6 years in the Israeli Air Force as a helicopter pilot, Elan went on to pursue a career in Jewish education. He is, of course, has a PhD from the Jewish Theological Seminary and has taught in many, many forums and spaces in Israel and North America and around the world. And on a personal note, Elan is a mentor to me as well, and has been working in these areas of Jewish education, tour education in Israel, and so much. Just a personal world of Mazal Tov. Elan raced here from the Brit Milah of his grandson this morning. Oh. So it's an extra special pleasure to have him with us, knowing the circumstances, and of course we're getting ready to wish him Mazal Tov in this coming fall, when his daughter is among the cadre of rabbis who will be ordained at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Israel, the Israeli rabbinic program this morning, marking the 100th rabbi to be ordained by our program there in Jerusalem. Please welcome, I should also say that, that most importantly, Elan is the author of the brand new book, Shvuya B'Chaloma. You have the introduction translated into English. It is hot off the presses. I know that we're very anxious to hear about that from Dr. Elan Ezrachi. Toda rabba.
So good afternoon. I would like to suggest a name change for this conference. Let's call it the 8th day. Because that's where my existential being is. I just came back from the Brit of my grandson, who, if his parents would not be graduate students at Princeton, he would be living on Emek Rephaim Street in Jerusalem. But I do have now an American, hopefully an American Zionist grandson, and let's wish that Zeh Katan Gadol Yeh, may he grow up in a world where in 50 years, the next conference that he will attend, and he'll probably be maybe even a speaker, you can talk about all the great things that would happen in the coming 50 years. So join me with Ken Yehi Ratzon. Let's see if this we do have a few slides coming up, so. So I'm really delighted to be here this afternoon, and as Josh said, the program was condensed from a long program to a few hours, and in some ways it kind of reminds me of the 6-Day War. It's a gigantic war that was condensed into 6 days. This is actually not just a funny segue. This is actually a very serious issue, because we have to really take into consideration that these gigantic changes and transformations in our lives took place over a very short period of time, and that's actually not a good idea. Not that I suggest that wars should be longer, but I would definitely think of changes like this, that they should take maybe over a little more evolutionary way, rather than these jumps that we went through. So my topic is focusing on the story of Jerusalem, the case of Jerusalem. Am I going to flip the slides? Thank you. And here I'd like to argue that Jerusalem is, on the one hand, and the story, of course, of the unification of Jerusalem. On the one hand, it's a reflection of the bigger story of the 6-Day War. In some ways, it's even a metaphor of the whole war. But on the other hand, the story of Jerusalem is also unique, and the microcosm, the specific case of Jerusalem, also has its own unique parameters that I would focus on. That's my choice for today, and that's also the reason I wrote this book in Hebrew. Hopefully it will come out in English at some point, that basically argues that we have to pay attention to what happened in Jerusalem specifically, because it's not exactly the same set of issues that involves the entire spectrum, although there are some overlaps as well, of course. So I would say, first of all, remind ourselves that every conversation that we have about Jerusalem is multi-layered. That's very natural to say it in this room. It's spiritual, it's emotional, it's symbolic. It involves narratives, it involves politics. So we have to realize that whenever we have a conversation about Jerusalem, whether it's a half an hour in the basement of Hebrew Union College in New York, or whether it's a week-long seminar in Jerusalem, we will have to take into account that all these layers exist, and we're not coming into these conversations with an empty slate. So I just wanted to start with my story in Jerusalem. So my story in Jerusalem spans 3 generations. My Saba and Savta, my grandparents, moved to Palestine in 1911. They were Russian Jews, part of the second Aliyah wave, and they chose Jerusalem. They were secular people, and from that point on, my narrative began in Jerusalem. That Jerusalem is really probably the most significant challenge of the Zionist movement, and that is, how do we create a city of modern values, pluralism, openness, and fairness in a place like Jerusalem. It's easy to do in Tel Aviv. It's easy to do when you start a kibbutz from scratch. But try and do that in Jerusalem. This is really the mission that I think subconsciously my grandparents, who were then 23 years old when they came to Jerusalem, that's what they took upon themselves. The second generation is my father, born in Jerusalem, 1925. He was born, by the way, on the same day of the opening of Hebrew University, that great Zionist academic symbol of scholarship. And he was also the first child born in the neighborhood of Rehavia, kind of the symbol of modern Jewish Zionist urbanism. And I was born in the 50s in the divided city of Jerusalem. So my formative years, I was 12 years old during the war, were shaped in a city that was very different than the city that I grew up in as an adolescent and as a young adult. So I would like to take you through a few images of those transformations and talk about the change that occurred, both in terms of how we have become different than what we were before, but also some of the issues and challenges that we had to face ever since the city has changed in such a dramatic way. So first of all, let's go back to before 1967. You know, we talk about the 50 years, and there's so much to talk about. But in the case of Jerusalem, I would also suggest in every conversation that you have that it's imperative to talk about the reality of Jerusalem before 67. This was a very different city, and the comparison of the before and the after is actually something which I think is very fruitful for every conversation. So that's the city I grew up in, and just this is an illustration of the dividing line. Just with a show of hands here in the room, how many people actually were in Jerusalem at least once before 1967? Okay, so there's a sizable minority here. This is really a story that is about to be forgotten in terms of a personal memory. Actually Jerusalem was a city that an international border between 2 hostile countries ran just in the middle of the city, leaving at least 4 significant Jewish symbols on the other side: the Kotel, the Jewish Quarter, the Jewish Cemetery on Mount of Olives, and Mount Scopus, the site of Hebrew University and Hadassah Hospital. But my consciousness and my existential reality was not living daily and looking at the other side and asking the question, when are we going to reconnect with the Kotel? That was not my upbringing. We had really 2 types of motifs that characterized my childhood. One was a motif of a city that was at the edge of the country, a city that is ala katzeh, where every place you walk a little further than you need to, you might hit a sign, atzor gvul lefanecha, stop, danger, a border ahead of you. And images like this that you may remember or you may have seen characterized this motif of our life. Jerusalem is a divided city where the sense of this division was a sense of agony, of something wrong, something improper, something that shouldn't happen. And it manifested itself in all kinds of barbed wires and protective walls, and poor people who lived in those areas, because who would live in an area like that, and so forth. So one motif was the motif of the border, the motif of Jerusalem being cut in the middle in a very arbitrary, irrational way. This, for example, a picture from the Mamila, the very elegant Mamila area today. And another picture is from the street where, if you've been to Jerusalem recently, where the light rail makes the curve from Jaffa Street into the old city. There was a dividing line near the Notre Dame monastery. So this was one theme that kind of organized our existential reality, living on the border. But this was not the main story of our lives. The main story of our lives in those days was the story of building the new capital of the State of Israel. So in many ways, most of the time, we actually turned our back to the border, and the zeitgeist of the time was, wow, the State of Israel has just been born, and now we are building the new capital of Israel after David Ben-Gurion announced in December 1949 that Jerusalem will be the capital against the international community standards. And the images that I grew up in were the images of a new city, brand new city, that looks very different. You see the signs of here, the Israel Museum is going to be built, the Knesset building in construction, the absorption of masses of new immigrants from the various countries they came from in the 1950s and 60s. So the Jerusalem that I grew up in was a very upbeat, positive, west-looking, westward in its orientation city that actually was a very fun city and very pleasant city to live in. It was quiet, it was developing, it was growing. It symbolized the new achievement of modern Israel. And this is the city of my childhood, until 1967. Now there's an open question. This is the site of the Hadassah Hospital that was built to replace the Hadassah Hospital, which was on Mount Scopus. So the open question that I'd like to end this segment is, did we really expect to see a change? This is a historical question. And when you ask both people who lived through this period, there are enough people with a lot of good memories, and you look at the historians and the records, I would summarize this chapter by saying that when it came to, let's call it the literary aspects of Israeli life, poetry, text, things that had to do with a little bit of a kind of a higher level of discourse, then the discourse was a discourse of yearning. Oh, we lost that place. Our holy sites are on the other sides. When will we be reconnecting to them? A famous poet expressed that, Yitzhak Shalev, Meir Shalev's father, who was a secular right-wing poet, and there was a real sense of kind of spiritual yearning to connect with the other side. But when you look at this more sociologically, culturally, politically, and from day-to-day life, the answer was, it's probably not going to happen in our lifetime. Yes, there's something wrong in the way the War of Independence ended, and we'll have to probably cope with this for the foreseeable future. And to do that, just to exemplify this, I'd like to read, I'll actually translate it simultaneously into English. I'd like to read a short dialogue, I think it's on the page, between the Israeli poet and then journalist Chaim Guri and the commander of the general of Central Command, Uzi Narkis, who then became one of the commanders of the battle over Jerusalem. And they have in 1965, Chaim Guri writes the following. He says, "Hapam tiyalnu leorech hakav ha'ironi." This time we took a walk along the urban line, which was the name of the international border. Uzi Narkis now is the general of Central Control, and I'm a Jerusalemite who's now in love with this enchanted city, says Chaim Guri. When Chaim Guri asks Uzi Narkis, the general, until when will this strange, odd situation continue, Narkis answers. And he says, we have to be ready to live like this for many, many years, shanim al shanim. This situation will remain forever, but it can also change every day. We know that this is the border, and this is it. We have to get used to it. Nigzar aleinu, it has been forced on us to live like this, and this is how we live. A generation has been born that has never heard anything else, and never knew any alternative, and never knows what exists on the other side of the border. That's a conversation from 1965. And Uzi Benziman, a journalist in Haaretz, who later on writes a book on the unification of Jerusalem, summarizes this whole thing, and he says, before the 5th of June, 1967, the Kotel, kind of the metaphor of the other side, the Western Wall, was a destination that could not be reached. There's no doubt that if that this wall did not occupy the minds, the thoughts of the majority of the Israeli public before June 7th, the day the war in Jerusalem ended. Until then, the Kotel was a distant site on the other side of barbed wires and cement and concrete walls. No one thought seriously that there's going to be any possibility of revisiting that site. That was Uzi Benziman's summary about the period before 1967. And then comes the war. Now the war, here again I'd like to nuance the story of Jerusalem in comparison to the bigger story. So most of us, I think, grew up and remember the great anxiety that existed before the war, that Israel might be anything between suffering severe damage and loss to being wiped out. That was kind of the feeling of those 3 weeks of preparation for the war, which of course prevailed also in Jerusalem. And I remember the sights of filling sand sacks with sand and plastering tapes on the windows. You were in Argentina then, right, Ambassador Zayan? And my father was in reserve duty. He was 42 years old. So these were very, very powerful memories of the way I saw that period of anxiety. But the interesting thing about Jerusalem was that the prediction was there would not be war in Jerusalem. The main anxiety was focused on the Egyptian front and on the Syrian front. The assumption was, and this is not, I'm not reflecting the mood on the street. I'm reflecting now what the generals predicted in Israeli intelligence, that the Jordanians would stay out of the war. So on June 5th, and by the way, this year, as you notice, the same days of the Six-Day War are on the same days of the week as they were then. So on Monday, June 5th, 1967, we, the children of Jerusalem, went to school. It was not a regular day. It was a day full of tension and full of anxiety. But the idea was to keep the life in Jerusalem as normal as possible. So we went to school. And at 10:30 in the morning, the war broke out in Jerusalem with the Jordanian offense that I assume you've read about in the various history books. And the whole situation changed. We had to be rushed to the bomb shelters of the school, and then during the day until the evening, the parents somehow came to the schools and collected all the kids. And if parents couldn't come, then kids went to be with their friends. And we went into the bomb shelters. In my case, it was not even a bomb shelter. There was some kind of a makeshift corridor in a floor lower than the apartment that we lived in. And we entered a war in Jerusalem when it was thought that there would not be a war in Jerusalem. So think of that mindset. But that lasted 48 hours. On Wednesday, at 1 o'clock, we were allowed to leave the bomb shelters, and you won't know these. And Moshe Dayan, Minister of Defense, read a statement that was not written in any Israeli leader's notebook until that day or until the night before, a statement that shapes the Israeli narratives from this moment and on. And I'd like to read this statement very, very carefully, especially the first part of it. It says, "This morning, the IDF liberated Jerusalem." Notice every word is already resonating with what we're going to be talking about in the coming decades. Liberated Jerusalem. We have reunited the divided Jerusalem, the split capital of Israel. We have returned to our holiest sites, L'Kadoshim Shebemekomoteinu. That's how it's in Hebrew. We came back in order to never part way from them. And this, in hours, is changing the face of Israeli consciousness, Jewish consciousness, geopolitics in the region. This is a transformation of a magnitude. I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not I am an anthropologist. I'm not a psychologist, and I cannot imagine a more radical collective transformation than something that goes like this in 48 hours. Now, it's interesting that the Israeli government at that point is not fully confident about this thing. It's an emerging story, and the war is continuing to take place in other fronts until the following Sunday. So the second paragraph kind of reflects the more of a hesitation of what did we get ourselves into. And it says to our Arab neighbors, we extend even at this time, and even more so at this time, our hand for peace. And so, and to the members of the other religions, the Christians and the Muslims, I assure that full freedom and all religious rights will be preserved. So here you already begin to see that the Israeli government is mindful of the fact that this is not just about connecting to the Kotel. It's not about reaching the holiest sites. Now we have to manage a very complicated situation within an urban context. And that's the beginning of the transformation, not only on the symbolic or the emotional level, but also on the political level. So from now on, as I said, we are with an entirely new narrative that will fit nicely, so to speak, in the narrative of the Six-Day War, but this is a unique narrative of Jerusalem. And the narrative basically says what it says here in the Moshe Dayan statement, Shlema, Meuchedet, Ubeshilton Israel. Shlema, whole, Meuchedet, united, Ubeshilton Israel, and under Israeli control. These three elements, you cannot take one of them if you want to understand the Israeli narrative. And this narrative operates from now on, and now we're going into decades. I'm not, Josh, you can also relax. I'm not going to divide the 50 years in the way I divided the time so far. We're going to end on time. The narrative works on two levels. It works first and foremost on the emotional, symbolic, and cultural level. And I would say that it has too much of an emphasis on that. We are very, very invested in this emotional transformation. And many of us, including many Israelis, are stuck there. They don't move to the next part of the narrative, even though it exists. And the next one is the narrative of the political, the practical, the steps that have to be taken on the ground in order to create a new reality in Jerusalem. That's not just a set of policies, that's a narrative that is going to dominate the reality of Jerusalem, and that many of us have kind of said, oh, that's not interesting, these are details. We're going to focus just on this emotional transformation. Now, what is the emotional transformation? It's the connecting to the wall, first and foremost. And it's really interesting from an anthropological point of view to see how the wall is transformed within hours from a site that really, Beinenu, most people, I hope there are no journalists in the court, most people really did not care about. It was not really prominent in the Israeli consciousness, to a place which became probably the hub of all the emotions of the time. It kind of contained all the feelings of relief from the tremendous anxiety. So everybody wants to go to the Kotel, and within 3 days, the Israeli government opens the plaza of the Kotel, destroys the neighborhood, the Mugrabi neighborhood in front of the Kotel, creates the plaza, and then the holiday of Shavuot, 3 days after June 11th, a pilgrimage holiday. So look at the symbolism. 250,000 Israelis walk to the wall in a path that was selected just for that because the city was still not open. And here are some of the images of the wall in the first few days. These are the people walking to the wall, the bulldozers coming in and in 3 days clearing the plaza of the wall. And look at the image on the bottom right. I love this picture. It's in my book also. It's everything contrary to what the wall is today. It's a symbol of a secular national site rather than a religious, orthodox, divisive domain. But these were the days in which unity and the symbolism of the war and of Jerusalem and of the Kotel were of a completely different meaning. And of course, if I had more time, I would elaborate on that. Egged announces a tour to the Kotel already on June 15th. You can pick it up in Netanya. At 7:15, you'll be getting a bus in Netanya. Egged restores bus transportation to the old city. And this is all the symbolic elements of the unification. Add to that also the re-establishment of Jewish life in the Jewish quarter, restoring activity on Mount Scopus, a whole cultural renaissance of songs and plays and musicals and movies on Jerusalem. Modern archaeology comes to Jerusalem with a storm. Tourism evolves. And finally, a new kind of holiday is invented on the Jewish calendar, Yom Yerushalayim, a holiday that is supposed to celebrate this unification. So that's on the symbolic cultural level. On the political level, and this is where I'm going to end my presentation, on the political level, and here is the story that I think most educated, and I will say Israelis, are actually clueless about. It's interesting when I have reactions from people who grew up in my generation and know exactly what happened in the Six-Day War in general, and they know Israeli history. They're kind of clueless of what happened in Jerusalem in the making of a new city that will be united, whole, and under Israeli control. So the most dramatic thing was the creation of a new set of boundaries of the city of Jerusalem. So what the Israeli government did within 2 weeks, this is an Israeli government that was as decisive as I think almost all Israeli governments have not been, except for Menachem Begin in the peace agreement with Egypt and Ariel Sharon pulling out of Gaza. But here in 2 weeks, they decided to create a new reality in Jerusalem that included West Jerusalem, as you see it, included the Jordanian definition of East Jerusalem, and then they created this line that goes all around, and that is these are the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem until this very day. 127 square kilometers. Has never been a city like this in, right? Wonderful. There's never been a city like this in the history of the region. There was never Jerusalem like this. They invented a new metropolis. There was a logic to it. The logic was that the assumption was that most of the newly conquered, occupied territories will be returned to whoever owned them before. So therefore, it's important to solidify a large united Jerusalem under Israel's control. There was a logic to it. Little did they know what would be the reality of the region 50 years later. So the first and the most dramatic thing was the expansion of the boundaries of Jerusalem to do this. Second thing was the physical unification of two hostile cities with two hostile communities living side by side. So the walls had to come down. And this is another wonderful picture of days after the opening of the kind of a Berlin imagery of people walking back and forth. You see Jews and Arabs mixing. This was not a natural, love affair. This was something that had to be monitored closely and to see what was the dynamics of this over time. Here's a picture of the restoration of the bus number 9, the line that was remained unused until unification, Kav Tesha. But probably the most dramatic Israeli activity on the political, practical, on the ground, so to speak, level was the building of the new neighborhoods. And I'll show you a couple of images, and then I want to go back to the map, and we will end around there. So basically, in order to create this metropolis called Jerusalem, the government of Israel, both in the purpose of filling those empty spaces and also creating a demographic edge for the Jewish community, built these gigantic peripheral neighborhoods in Jerusalem. Each one is the size of a small town. Can anyone recognize this one? This is Ramot in the northern part of Jerusalem. 40,000 people live in Ramot today. There's no relationship between Ramot and historical Jerusalem. But ask people in Ramot where did they live in, they would say we live in a neighborhood of Jerusalem. So the creation of these, here we have some images of this mass public, this is the neighborhood of Pisgat Ze'ev, also in the northern part of Jerusalem, 50,000 residents. And if I go back to the map, you can just go with your fingers and with your eyes from the north. It's Neve Yaakov, Pisgat Ze'ev, Ramot, Ramat Shlomo, Givat Tzarfatit, French Hill, Ramat Eshkol, Armon HaNatziv, Har Choma, Gilo also, 40-something thousand residents. That changed the urban landscape of Jerusalem in a dramatic way. It spread out the city. It created a sense of alienation between these neighborhoods and the center of the city. And one of the kind of essential outcomes of this thing was also the gap between these highly developed, beautifully planned neighborhoods and the neglected Arab neighborhoods that remained in the conditions that they were before. Israel changed the entire public sphere by naming streets and highways and creating a different look for Jerusalem. There was a practical way of also including the Palestinians in it by giving them a status which looked better than the status of having no status and short of being full citizens. And that enabled the Palestinians and the Israelis to kind of come to some kind of a corpus operandi of, okay, we can share the city, we can work together, we can work on how to function in a city which is so full of conflict. I'll end with just saying a few things about the Israeli narrative in retrospect that are worthy of consideration. First of all, this whole Israeli story, the story of the unification of Jerusalem, received a wall-to-wall, right-to-left consensus in Israeli society. There was an overwhelming support of world Jewry in this process. There was a weak rejection or weak objection of the international community. The international community said, it's not good, but it let Israel do what it wants. And most important, Jerusalem was taken out of the discourse in Israel and around the world on the conflict. Yes, there's the conflict, and what should settlements? Yes, no. Territories, should we return them? Should we not return them? Palestinian state? Yes, no. Jerusalem, don't touch it. That's already decided, and that's the illusion that we're paying a very high price for. We said to ourselves time and again that Jerusalem's unification is not occupation. We said that these neighborhoods are not settlements, that these are neighborhoods. We taught ourselves that the Israeli Arabs are actually receiving fair treatment, and they should be appreciative of that. And we felt that this unification was historically legitimate. It's kind of sgirat cheshbon. It's settling an account with a very unfair situation that we had to endure in the time before. But in reality, we created a very large city, not logical from an urban point of view, that is developing according to political parameters, that does not have an ethos of equality and multiculturalism. And I'm very happy to say that our president, Ruby Rivlin, in the speech on the 50th anniversary of the unification, on Ammunition Hill, the most symbolic element of the war, said clearly, boldly, Jerusalem has not yet been united. And we have a lot of work to do. And we brought, in many ways, the dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into Jerusalem, while at the same time facing a growing Arab minority who's very hostile, and many challenges that are facing us. I will say, just as a positive note, as a final sentence, that the story is not a pessimistic story, and that is in my book. Because Jerusalem and the residents of Jerusalem have a real joie de vivre, and they are going against all these outside trends of the politicians and the outside forces of the various governments, municipalities, United Nations, and so forth, and they are managing to create a web of life in Jerusalem that is so fascinating. It's written in my book. Come see us in Jerusalem. We'll continue this conversation.
Toda rabba to Elan for framing the conference in the way that you did, and really incredible footage that I'm sure many of us have not seen before.